Hello, welcome to EVN Report. My name is Maria Titizian, and this month, once again, we are having a discussion with Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. He is the author of our monthly EVN Report security briefing. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
My pleasure, Maria.
This month's security briefing we have called Frozen Conflict Resistance and Strategic Negligence. And as we all saw, events in April in the region, in Nagorno-Karabakh, further confirmed what you say is Russia's ineffectiveness as a security partner and a regional power. Armenia realized that Russia's desertion of its obligation was not a conditional phenomenon, but what you called strategic negligence, leading to the collapse of the Russo-Armenian security partnership. I'm going to start off with a very basic question. Has Russia now become an obstacle to improving Armenia's security situation?
To a large extent that it has. In the past, Armenia operated under the logic that Russia was a security guarantor and a reliable security partner. That obviously diminished to a large extent after 2020, and specifically, as we've talked about, after November and September of 2022, when Azerbaijan did a wide-scale attack on Jermuk, among other, the entirety of the front line. So all of these sort of, develop questions as to, whether Russia's responsibilities towards Armenia with respect to the various treaties and security obligations that it has, are those sustainable, or have they ever been true with respect to these obligations? And to a large extent, Armenia has come to the conclusion that this is not the case. And most of the evidence kind of points to this. And so with the diminishing of Russian influence in the region and the diminishing role that Russia has played in Armenia's security architecture, or the collapse of it, the dynamics have changed. And Armenia has sought to fill this vacuum, this void, by appealing to diplomacy and to different actors that are not Russia. Russia's response to this has been to basically create obstacles to Armenia's security. And this is the strategic negligence that the security report talks about. Now, the broader concern and the question that comes up is, why is Russia doing this? What is the objective of strategic negligence? And of course, by virtue of engaging in strategic negligence, Russia is serving as an obstacle to Armenia's security. And so the important objective here is to sort of unravel and understand what the underlying strategy here is for this growing doctrine. We need to note that Russia's fundamental objective with respect to Armenia and to other parts of the region has been to sustain influence and dominance. With the growing rupture in Armenia-Russo relationships, Russia needs a mechanism to bring Armenia back into its fold. And so strategic negligence is designed to basically enhance Armenia's dependence on Russia. The more problematic or more concerning Armenia's security vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, the more Armenia would need Russia. And so by engaging strategic negligence, Russia is making it more conducive for Armenia to become relatively more desperate and thus return to Russia's orbit. And so strategic negligence is designed to enhance Armenia's dependence on Russia. So ever since, as I noted, September 2022, Armenia has understood that it cannot be dependent on Russia and has slowly pivoted west. Russia's objective is to enhance Armenia's insecurity, therefore forcing Armenia to desperately rely on Russia. And so it's counterintuitive, but fundamentally the output remains the same: to enhance the security architecture by creating more dependence on Russia.
Right, and this could also answer as to why Azerbaijan has been able to push certain buttons and push limits right under the nose of Russian peacekeepers. And as frustrating as it is for us, I think if we look deeper into it and understand Russia's policy of conflict persistence, right? That's its policy in the region, and therefore by allowing Azerbaijan to keep moving the chess pieces, if you will, it's creating this constant conflict. Is it a way of it getting Armenia to engage and lead it to a new conflict?
So That's one component of it. But we have to understand that ever since the 1990s, one of the policies that Russia has had with respect to maintaining a geopolitical dominance as a hegemon in the various spheres that it engages this kind of behavior in, is to implement some notion of a frozen conflict. So whenever post-Soviet states that are within Russia's orbit or spheres of influence have engaged in conflict, Russia has mediated in these conflicts as arbiter. But in its extent, to the extent to which it acted as arbiter, Russia has engaged in what we call authoritarian conflict management. So Russia imposes a frozen conflict and then manages that conflict. At time, it thaws into warfare. At time, it goes back to a frozen state where it's hybrid warfare, or what do we call in Armenia, neither war nor neither peace. So that phenomenon, and this allows Russia to control that conflict. So in the post Artsakh War period, we have seen Armenia seeking some level of stability and constantly appealing to peace, where Azerbaijan has engaged in the opposite modality of behavior. And we have to understand that it is against Russia's strategic interest to have peace in the region, not because Russia is evil or anything like that. This is not a value judgment, but rather it is in Russia's strategic interest to maintain frozen conflicts. If you have peace, if you have solution to the frozen conflict, Russia's capacity to manage conflict is no longer there because peace has achieved. So to that extent, Azerbaijan's behavior, which is consistent with conflict persistence, does align with Russia's interest at this point. So if Russia wants the frozen conflict to sustain itself or to thaw from time to time, and for Russia to manage this development, it needs conflict persistence. Armenia right now is speaking in the language of peace. That contradicts a conflict persistence, whereas Azerbaijan is doing the opposite. So within that capacity, there is an alignment with respect to Russia and Azeri interests as far as mitigating or creating obstacles for regional peace.
Okay, you wrote in this month's security briefing that since 2016, Azerbaijan has become Russia's partner, excuse me, in enhancing its frozen conflict toolkit. And this Russo-Azerbaijani tandem is similar to the Russo-Armenian tandem prior to 2018. Can you explain this further, please?
Sure, we need to be honest, intellectually honest about these developments. So, ever since 1994, when we had the ceasefire for the first Artsakh War, Armenia's position was one of maintaining the status quo. In 1997, 98, there were discussions of sort of, doing a step-by-step resolution to the conflict, so on and so forth, and that led to the collapse of their Petrosian administration. Ever since then, Armenia's position has been singular and really not negotiable. That the issue of Artsakh is fundamentally going to be defined by its independence, that the other regions that Armenia had taken control over, the buffer zones were negotiable, but that fundamentally Armenia would serve as a security guarantor of Artsakh, and that Artsakh's independence and the territories that we consider to be part of the Oblast of Nagorno-Karabakh was non-negotiable. Azerbaijan's posture was completely the opposite, right? That not only Artsakh's independence is an absurdity to them, that they want everything back within the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. So you had two extremes. Now, the negotiations that proceeded through the entirety of this period produced no outcome, because if they produced any outcome, you would have some notion of peace, and therefore the frozen conflict would be resolved. Armenia played an instrumental role in obstructing one component of the peace process as we sought to maintain the status quo. And in that context, we were not really very constructive in proceeding to establish some modality of peace. And this was consistent with Russian interest. Azerbaijan was even worse than us because Azerbaijan also took a very maximalist position. Therefore, you had two sides with maximalist positions that allowed for conflict persistence. And this was consistent with Russia's need for authoritarian conflict management. And so for a long time, both Armenia and Azerbaijan played a role in maintaining conflict persistence. And because Russia had a lot more leverage with respect to Armenia, until 2020, Armenia's position was no different. In the last year and a half, of course, Armenia is now speaking the language of peace. And this is outside of Russia's playbook because Since 1994, neither Armenia or Azerbaijan has spoken in the language of peace. We have spoken the language of negotiations, but always reserved the right to engage in force as a mechanism of deterrence against the other. And so, this modality of conversation, this new narrative, is inherently contradicting Russia's capacity for conflict management. Because Armenia is saying is we want a resolution to the conflict, and Russia is saying I can't have resolution to the conflict because that completely diminishes my regional influence. And so Azerbaijan, therefore, to go back to our initial point, is serving now the mechanism of allowing conflict persistence.
Okay, in past briefings and past conversations that we've had on this platform, we've talked about how Moscow is playing by Baku's playbook. But in the larger context, can we say that Russia has lost influence in Baku and in Yerevan?
Absolutely. We have to understand that Russia lost a lot of influence in Armenia, both with respect to soft power and also within Armenia's security apparatus, when Armenia realized that its security architecture had collapsed and Russia was no longer a reliable security partner. Well, when you're no longer a reliable security partner, you're not really a security partner. And so this realization, right, this dependency that Armenia had on Russia, that they are our security guarantor, therefore we need to abide by their wishes, that leverage is no longer there. And so, of course, influence has diminished. With respect to Azerbaijan, Russia's influence was not to the same extent as it was to Armenia's, but still Russia exercised a lot of hard power influence in the region. The Ukraine war changed that dynamic because Russia's attention right now and its resources are diverted to the Ukrainian front. It no longer has the relative power and the regional hegemonic influence that it used to have vis-a-vis Azerbaijan. So for two different reasons and developments, we have seen a diminishing of Russian regional power, one with Armenia with respect to the collapse of the security architecture, and one with Azerbaijan with respect to Russia no longer having the same levels of power. And this diminishing, of course, has created serious complications. Armenia feels unprotected, specifically after September of 2022, while Azerbaijan feels emboldened. And this has completely and continuously contributed to Armenia's growing insecurity. And this is why I make the point that Russia's strategic negligence has created an obstacle to Armenia's security, because an emboldened Azerbaijan and an unprotected Armenia is completely enhancing the security and power disparity.
Okay, let me just, I don't mean to harp on this issue, but as we saw, Azerbaijan moved to create a new checkpoint at the entrance of the corridor. And this, of course, has raised even graver concerns for Armenia, obviously for the 120,000 Armenians living in Karabakh. And this happened right under the nose of Russian peacekeepers. It wasn't that they were ineffective or they couldn't have stopped it. We could say the same thing about how the so-called eco-activists, blockaded the corridor for over 4 months, when it was very clear that the Russian peacekeepers could have allowed at least one passage, one lane, for people to keep moving. If Russia is losing influence, but at the same time it feels as though it is allowing Azerbaijan to get closer and closer to its objective of strangulating the people of Artsakh and creating a situation where it will lead to outright ethnic cleansing, or without a bullet being fired, people just leaving once the roads are open. So this is what I'm trying to understand, and I think many of us are trying to grapple with this.
That's a great question. That is a very multi-tiered and nuanced question, and there's various sort of analytical levels and empirical reference that allow answers to this important concern that you have. So Russia has two sort of general objectives with respect to letting Azerbaijan keep pushing the envelope, so to speak, or to get its way. But this doesn't mean that it's allowing Azerbaijan to get to its final objective, and we'll get to that in a second. The one component, of course, is that this allows Azerbaijan to exercise agency and for the Aliyev regime to go back to its people and say, look how we're taking control over Artsakh, and therefore we have a strong government, and our regime is persistent, and we are defeating the Armenians, etc., etc., etc. So there's a very important element of a domestic consumption here with respect to these sort of performative checkpoints that they put forth. Second, right, why does Russia allow this? And there are two components to that as well. First, it's no secret that Russia is seeking the collapse of the Velvet government in Armenia. And so Russia's objective is that the more of a crisis that you have in Nagorno-Karabakh and Artsakh, and this began with the so-called eco, activists blocking launching all the way to the establishment of the recent checkpoint. The intent was that Russia keeps allowing this, as you noted, they could disallow it. They kept allowing this, operating under the logic that if there's a crisis in Artsakh, it'll create domestic concerns and political instability in Armenia. That hasn't worked out. But those remain the objectives because Russia's playbook still operates off of the 90s and the early 2000s. And so tying developments in Artsakh to domestic developments in Armenia is part of the Russian playbook, but that has not produced the results that Russia wants. So there's that one component. The second component is that to make the situation in Artsakh so dire that it'll force the Republic of Armenia to be to sort of, in a very desperate way, crawl back to Russia and ask Russia to solve the problem. And that will bring Armenia back to the dependency structure and back into the orbit of Russia. So, the more difficult you make the situation and the less tools that Armenia has to solve this situation, Russia's assumption is that Armenia will return to the dependency structure, thus leading to an enhancement of Russian influence over Armenia. So those factors are clearly designed to both weaken Armenia, but this weakness will translate into more Russian dependence, therefore enhancement of Russian influence in Armenia and possibly into the region. The consequence of this, of course, as you noted, is that it basically gives Azerbaijan a lot more agency. And will it lead to Azerbaijan achieving its objectives by basically, cleansing Artsakh of the Armenian population, perhaps not by force, but also by virtue of these developments? And does that not contradict Russian interests? And the argument that I would make is that Russia has internal red lines with Azerbaijan, that Azerbaijan will continue to proceed engaging in this kind of behavior, but Azerbaijan has stopped short of two important things. For one, this blockade has not led to the humanitarian crisis that we all feared it would. Azerbaijan is very clever about this, right? So they are going to create a situation where life is very difficult for Armenians, but it doesn't lead to the crisis that we would assume it could lead to, and thus you would have a mass exodus. Second, Russia also reserves the right to basically push back towards Azerbaijan should Azerbaijan's behavior contradict Russian interests. Not the interest of Armenians or the interest of the Artsakh Armenians, but rather Russian interests. And at this point, we have not gotten there. So if we look at how things have developed with the Lachin blockade, or if we look at how things have developed with this checkpoint, we're seeing a lot of synchronized behavior here. There's a certain synergy with respect to, Azeris allowing Russian troops to move through, Russian convoys to move through, or even in the performance that we saw recently with the checkpoint that, Russian presence is there, that, Russian troops are escorting Armenian villagers, etc., etc. There's a lot of orchestration here that simply does not suggest that there's a clash between the two countries, because there's a consistent Russian presence in all of the things that Azerbaijan is doing, and we cannot be blind to that. And so that in of itself suggests that these are synchronized activities precisely designed to punish both the Republic of Armenia and also create problems politically for Armenian society.
Okay. Do you think that there are certain, I want to come back to something you noted about red lines that Russia has. If Azerbaijan were to engage in outright ethnic cleansing, in a new aggression, a new attack that would lead to, hundreds or thousands, God forbid, deaths, would at that point Russia step in to stop Azerbaijan, because it hasn't done in the past? So why would it do it now?
Well, Russia is banking on two things. One, they're pretty certain that the international community would step in before Russia has to step in, because as when it comes to ethnic cleansing, this has been a red line from the broader West. And so Azerbaijan has been threading the line very, very carefully, right? One of the few points that made very vigorously is that we are not creating a humanitarian crisis. That is an absurd argument. Don't talk to us about ethnic cleansing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're very, very sensitive to that. So they tend to be very careful with that. Now, assuming they assume they had sufficient political capital to go through with it, right? To go through ethnic cleansing, Russia would step in that context to curb those developments, not because it cares about the people of Artsakh, because Russia needs the Armenian population in Artsakh to maintain the Russian presence in Artsakh. So if you have ethnic cleansing and the population of Artsakh en masse leaves, then the Russian peacekeepers have no relevance there, right? They would have no reason to stay there. And that means an important strategic component of the Russian presence in the South Caucasus, which is to have a Russian peacekeeping force in Nagorno-Karabakh, would be diminished. So in that context, I don't see Russia allowing this to happen because, Russia's objective since 1994 has been to have boots on the ground. And the boots on the ground that it has is justified by virtue having an Armenian population in Artsakh. This is why they're not going to allow an ethnic cleansing. But doesn't matter how hard conditions are for the Artsakh people or how much that they're suffering, that's secondary to the Russians. And so it's important for us not to conflate Azerbaijan's egregious behavior and their collective punishment with the Armenian people, and the extent to which Russia will allow that to translate into ethnic cleansing.
And this is perhaps also why it's only the Russian side, if I'm not mistaken, who keeps talking about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh and saying, let's keep it for the future, which is what we've seen for the last 30 years. While the West really hasn't been talking about status so much, they're talking about something else, which is a whole other conversation, obviously, that we need to have at one point. So obviously, Russia's intention, like you said, is this persistence of the conflict. That's why it's throwing in the status.
No, this is a double-edged sword. Okay, Armenia wants peace, obviously, but on what terms and to what extent? The West comes in and says we need to have peace in the region. This will diminish Russian power. This will lead to democratic growth in Armenia. It will lead to economic growth in the region, its stability, so on and so forth. So far, so good. But then we ask the West, okay, what about the people of Artsakh, right? And the West comes back with this whole conversation of whatever peace treaty there is, there's going to be a guarantee of the security rights of the Artsakh people. But when we start talking about status, that's where it gets complicated. But at least the West says we need to have a solution if Armenia has to take some kind of a hit on the status issue that is worth it in relation to conflict persistence, continued instability, economic undevelopment, etc., etc., etc. So that's one side of the conversation, right, which is inherently problematic to us, but at least it allows us to understand where the roadmap is for that. Russia comes and says, I have no solutions. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to prolong the process where there's going to be a discussion of status down the line. We can talk about, in theory, what the rights and protection of the Armenian population would be, but I don't even know what that's going to look like, Russia says, because generally I'm not very good at talking about rights and protection of populations. And as far as peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan is concerned, really can't talk about that because that is heavily hinged on the status issue. So if you don't solve the status issue, you're not solving the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So euphemistically, you can have all kinds of negotiations that you want, but fundamentally, what Russia is talking about is conflict persistence and the animosity between the two sides never being resolved. So it's a question of where do we go with this? Conflict persistence is not going to allow Armenia to democratize to the extent that it needs to, and it's not going to allow Armenia to democratically develop because all the research shows that fractured countries or conflict-prone countries cannot have economic development. And so frozen conflicts are conducive to underdevelopment. So Russia's peace model or negotiation model is conducive to perpetual and persistent frozen conflict. The Western model attempts to alleviate and solve the thing of frozen conflict, but what they're asking from us is still a little unclear. We kind of know what they're hinting at, but they have to come out and say, listen, at least you need to recognize Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan, but we're going to give protection to this population. We're going to bring in international troops to protect them. And if Baku acts up and violates these norms, then we can start talking about the Kosovization of Artsakh. So there needs to be an honest discussion that should Aliyev regime engage in what we expect them to engage in, there are going to be repercussions. But until we're convinced that that is the case, Of course, we cannot agree to that. But we need to be intellectually honest about this. At least the Western model suggests some resolution. And Armenian society needs to have an honest conversation whether this resolution works for us. And if not, are we ready to engage in continuous warfare? The Russian model neither presents a solution, nor does it allow us to basically deal with development and growth. It basically says you're going to have what you've had since 1994, conflict persistence and frozen conflict. And I'm not sure if Armenian society is willing to accept that, because we can't have an iteration of 2020 every 7 years, every 10 years. And so the freezing and unfreezing of conflict is a serious, serious problem for us. And so this is the honest conversation that our society needs to have.
Well, both are impossible. I mean, if we look at it through that lens, I mean, at this particular juncture, both the Western version of events or the Russian persistence of this conflict management or conflict persistence puts Armenia in a horrible,
an impossible situation.
It's an
But within this impossible situation, you have to consider your strengths and weaknesses. With the Western model, what you could do is you could basically develop, re-strengthen yourself, and potentially the Kosovization of Artsakh will allow us to address the rights and the protection of that population. With the Russian model, you're not able to develop, you're not able to strengthen yourself, and you're not able to address the security and safety of the Artsakh people. So in this context, you're not going to get a win-win situation. Okay, that's an oversimplification, but you have to understand what at least allows you to enhance your capabilities, because we have to accept the fact that there are going to be no quick solutions, and we're talking about a 5 to 10 year trajectory as far as the next flare-up of this conflict is going to be. And to be kind of strategic at this and develop a grand strategy, where do we want to be 5 to 10 years from now? A relatively developed country that has the resources to potentially deter Azerbaijan and engage them, or to be in the state that we are, which is going to be continuous reliance on Russia, an unreliable partner, conflict persistence, and underdevelopment.
It's a terrible conundrum to be in, and every month I hope that we won't need to have this conversation, and that's naive thinking, obviously. Thank you for shedding light a bit on this month's security briefing. We'll be continuing to publish these briefings as we move forward in this situation that we find ourselves in. Thank you, Nerses.
Thank you, Maria.